on the Solano Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Plan. That's quite a mouthful. I apologize. You're going to be hearing a lot of acronyms and abbreviations tonight. Sorry about that. The two that you will probably hear the most are Groundwater Sustainability Agency, or GSA, and Groundwater Sustainability Plan, or GSP. We all appreciate you being here tonight. As of right now, we have 88 people participating. It's probably going to keep going up as we move along. I'd like to give you some context of why we think this is an important meeting. First and foremost, we are required to develop and submit a Groundwater Sustainability Plan, or GSP, to the state, specifically the Department of Water Resources. But more importantly, it allows us to dictate how we will protect groundwater at the local level. And groundwater is a vital resource for daily life in the Solano Subbasin, whether you are a grower or a rancher or rely on groundwater as your only source of water for drinking water. And equally important, we need all of you to understand what we are trying to do with this GSP. And we need you to review the plan and tell us if this is the right fit for the Solano Subbasin. Now, we do have a few members of the GSA with us tonight, and I'd like to introduce them. We have Mr. Paul Fuchslin representing the Solano Irrigation District GSA. We have Mr. Justin Cole from the Vacaville GSA. We have Linda Dorn from the Sacramento County GSA. We have Eric Ringelberg from the Northern Delta GSA. And looks like we have Misty Collett-Ryder joining me from the Solano GSA. I'd also like to introduce staff who are presenting tonight or helping behind the scenes, and there's quite a few of them. From Ag Innovations, we have Amy Ryan, Guadalupe Garcia, and Susanna Sossman. From Ludorf and Scalamini, we have Vicky Kretzinger and Nick Watterson. From Kenny Jenks, we have Sachi Itagaki, and I think maybe Jennifer Larson may be joining us later. From the Local Government Commission, we have Emily Finnegan and Deanna Gonzalez. And we also have Ben Wallace from the Freshwater Trust joining us as well. And I do apologize if I didn't get to you. There's well over 80 people, so I'm not sure I'm seeing all the names, but at this point, I'm gonna turn it back over to Amy to talk a little bit about Zoom.
Thanks, Chris. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay, so yes, if you haven't done so already, please enter a language channel. You'll see the little interpretation button at the bottom there, and you can enter the English channel. This is good, or the Spanish channel if you're a Spanish speaker. This is particularly important if we do get any questions in Spanish. So the whole call will be in English, but if we get questions in Spanish, you'll want to be able to follow along. And as Chris said, yes, my name is Amy Ryan. I am here with Ag Innovations, which is part of the team that's supporting the community engagement effort for the Solano GSP. So on behalf of both Ag Innovations, as well as the Local Government Commission and the Freshwater Trust, who are also here and supporting with the community engagement effort, we're so glad that you all are here. As Chris said, the numbers are climbing. I think we're now up to in the 90s, and just means so much to this process to have your time and you taking the evening to be with us. My role tonight is to make sure that your questions get answered, that your input is heard, and that we get out of here on time. So I'll be doing my best to do that. And I just want to reiterate what Chris has mentioned, and you'll hear us repeating it throughout the evening, just how important community input is to this process. And the plan is really made much more robust and much more meaningful when it's informed by the visions and the priorities of you community members. So we'll get into this as we go. And I just want to, again, encourage you to participate. We'll be having some polls as we go. So we really want you to participate in those and ask questions as they come up for you. So on that note, I just want to do a couple more brief Zoom guidelines for this evening. So this meeting is recorded and will be available on the Solano GSP website in just a few days. For most of the meeting, we'll be using the Q&A function. So on the bottom of your screen, if you move your mouse or tap your screen, if you're here on an iPhone or an iPad, you'll see these options. The Q&A box is where we'll be having, we'll be able to answer your questions if they're content related GSA or groundwater or GSP questions. And there will be opportunities to ask questions out loud. So from a few of you, there's many, so we won't get to everybody, but we'll have a few moments if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask some questions. And when the time comes, you'll be able to raise your hand, and that's your electronic hand because we can't see you. And so that's how you can do that, just that little icon there. Last is we will have the chat. I'm going to ask you guys to introduce yourselves in just a minute. And so the chat is going to be open for a few moments, and then we're going to turn the chat off, and just so that you can be able to chat with only the panelists, a host rather, if you have a technical question. Otherwise, if you ask content related questions through the chat, they won't get answered. So the chat, again, is just going to be for introductions, and then all of your questions will go into the Q&A box. Okay, so the introduction, we would love to have you guys share in the chat your name, where in the Solano subbasin you live, work, or farm, and what brings you here tonight. And just a sentence or a phrase about what brings you tonight. Again, there's now 82 of you, it looks like, so just keeping it short. But we would love, since you guys can't see each other, sometimes it's fun to be able to know who else is in the room with you. So having you guys introduce yourselves, and the GSA members who are here, we welcome you to do that and to put something in the chat. And if you didn't get acknowledged, if you're here on the team, we'd love for you to jump in there. So I'm going to leave the chat open. And yes, great. There's already some folks joining. Hi, Scott and Walter and Craig. Really glad Stephen McCord, Jack. Great. Welcome you all. Really glad that you're here with us this evening. We're going to leave the chat open for you to continue the introductions, and I'm going to move on just to keep things rolling. Okay, so our goals for tonight, I'm just going to review these briefly. And first order of business is going to discuss where the groundwater sustainability plan is in its phase of development. So Chris is going to go over the GSP and where we are in that process in just a moment. Then we're going to present and discuss the sustainable management criteria, which is really a key part of the GSP. We'll also be getting an update on the groundwater conditions in the Solano subbasin. We'll present and discuss the projects and management actions, how they address priorities in the subbasin, and discuss your community questions, concerns, and comments. And we'll also have a brief moment just to prepare and encourage you to give comments on the draft sections and the final draft GSP when it's released. So we'll go over that in a little bit, just so that you guys are ready and able to give comments in that way, which is a really important way to give your voice to this process. So the upshot of all of this is that this is a key moment for public input as we are in the process of completing the GSP. The things that we discussed tonight, which include as the sustainable management criteria and the projects and management actions. You'll get to know more about what those terms mean in a moment. We've imagined that the public will be interested in these. So these are pivotal parts of the GSP, and this is a great moment to have you here and providing your comments. As I said a minute ago, we'll have some polls as we go, and it's really helpful if you participate in those polls. The information that we gather from those really do inform the process, and we review them. They're not empty polls. We will look over the answers and take everything that you share into consideration. So we hope you participate in that way. Okay, so just briefly, our agenda for this evening, we're going to have, again, just an overview of the GSP development process, a quick overview of key terms and concepts so that you know more about these acronyms that we're talking about, the update on the groundwater conditions in the Solano subbasin, our hope for the future. That's our time to tell you about the sustainable management criteria and the project and management actions, and then some input sessions, and we'll have some Q&A throughout. And then a brief moment of next steps, and then we'll be out of here. So the last thing I'll say before we dive in about making the most of our time together, as much as you're able to keep your questions focused on groundwater and the groundwater sustainability plan, the GSP, and to ask those again in the Q&A box. We'll be turning off the chat in just a few seconds. And so again, we'll do our best to answer questions that aren't related to the GSP or to groundwater, but we will really be prioritizing questions that are. And if we don't get to your question, we invite you to email us at info@aginnovations.org. It's there on the screen, and one of my colleagues will put that in the chat. And we'd be happy to hear any comments or lingering questions after this event, if you have any. Okay, I think that's all for me. Chris, over to you.
All right, thank you, Amy. So good evening again. I'm going to give you, as Amy said, a brief overview of the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, or GSP. And I do apologize for some of you that probably already know this that have been attending some of our meetings, but the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was created by the state legislature and signed into law by the governor in the fall of 2014. It became effective January 1st, 2015, and required groundwater subbasins, which are medium, high, or critically overdrafted priority, to create a GSP. Our Solano subbasin is a medium priority subbasin, and that is why we are developing a GSP. I'm going to be going over a lot of content, a lot of information in a short amount of time, and I'm going to be skipping some details. So either Lupe or Susanna is going to be putting information on the Solano GSP website in the chat for you to go and check out. It's a really great website where we have a lot of information on groundwater. There's lots of other resources. You can find sections of the GSP to review and leave comments on. You can sign up for newsletters and hear about upcoming meetings. So go please check out our website. Next slide, please. All right, so groundwater management and groundwater itself is pretty technical. It's not something that most of us think about every day. And what we've tried to do with this document is make it a good read for most stakeholders. Each of these sections really is a summary of all the technical analysis behind the scenes. And for those of you that like to dig a little deeper, we have well over 24 appendices and several large technical memorandums that really dig into the data and the analysis. So that's all there as well. So I want to highlight some of the key elements of the GSP. Section 1, Introduction to the GSP. This is where we discuss beneficial uses of groundwater and beneficial users of groundwater. And a meeting such as tonight, public participation. Section 2 covers the plan area, where we discuss jurisdictional areas of the GSPs and things like land use elements. Section 3 covers the basin setting, where we can discuss the geology of the subbasin and the hydrogeologic conceptual model and surface and groundwater conditions. And then Section 4 covers historical, current, and projected water supplies. These first 4 sections are all up on our GSP website and ready for your review. And then as we move a little further into the document, this is kind of where we get into the meat of things. So Section 5 covers the water budget. Vicki is going to be going over that in a few slides here shortly, looking at some of our preliminary model results and some local groundwater conditions. Section 6 covers sustainability goals and indicators and undesirable results, which we wish to avoid. And Vicki has a few slides on that to go into some detail as well. Section 7 covers our monitoring, our data management and reporting. We have a pretty extensive monitoring network in place with our partner GSAs and a few other agencies within the subbasin. There are a few other areas where we would like to get a little information, and we'd like to contact a few landowners to see if they'd be willing to allow us to put some of our monitoring equipment in their wells so we can gather some more information in a few areas of the subbasin. Section 7 is also up on the website and ready for review. Section 8 covers management actions and projects, and Vicki's going to talk a little bit about that here shortly. And then Section 9 talks about plan implementation, how we're going to put everything in motion next year. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have a map of the Solano subbasin. It is essentially the eastern half of Solano County from Vacaville over to the east, with a bit spilling into Sacramento and Yolo counties. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have 5 GSAs working together. We're calling ourselves the Solano Collaborative. We have the City of Vacaville GSA. We have the Solano Irrigation District GSA, the Solano GSA, which I represent, Sacramento County GSA, and the Northern Delta GSA. Again, all working together over the last few years to develop this groundwater sustainability plan. Next slide, please. So how are we going to pay for all this? For development of the GSP, we've been very fortunate to have received 2 grants, one through Proposition 1 and another through Proposition 68 for a total of about $1.7 million. And we've had a local match of about the same, including cash from the agencies and thousands of hours of staff time working on this GSP over the last several years. We've also been very fortunate to have some additional support from DWR through Facilitation Support Services Grant, where we've had the Ag Innovations team and other teams, the Freshwater Trust and Local Government Commission, help us with outreach and education and facilitation. We've also received from DWR Technical Support Services grants, where we've had the Ludorf and Scalamini team work on some shallow monitoring wells near Puda Creek and a few other areas of the subbasin to help us better understand a few things in the shallower part of the aquifer. Now, for implementation of the GSP, we're also going to be looking for grants where possible, but we're also going to be looking at local fees to help pay for all the implementation aspects of the GSP. Now, we completely understand that growers and ranchers and homeowners are constantly bombarded by fees and assessments. You know, we get that. None of us like that, but this is necessary for us to maintain local control. If we cannot pay for the plan and manage our groundwater resources at the local level, the state water board can and will step in. And unfortunately, will probably charge a lot more than what we're potentially looking at. And what we're going to be doing over the next few months, probably at the tail end of the ag season, or as the ag season really ends, is start having another series of meetings with all stakeholders that are interested, to start sitting down and talking about fees and hear your concerns and issues and address, you know, what these fees will actually pay for, and let you know what we're looking at as we move into the implementation aspect of the GSP. So we're hoping by next spring or early summer, we kind of come to some consensus on what those fees will look like and what all the charges will be going towards. And then we'll probably start looking at charging fees in January of 2023, no sooner than that. Next slide, please. All right, so we have a huge team working on this groundwater sustainability plan. It takes a lot of people to put this all together, and you're going to be hearing from several of them tonight. And so we have Ludorf and Scalamini, we have Vicki Kretzinger and Nick Watterson, but there's several other people in their office that are working behind the scenes on the model and other aspects of the GSP. We have Sachi Itagaki and her team from Kennedy Jenks helping write the GSP. We have David's Engineering helping with modeling and the water budget. We have Wes Yost helping with project development and management actions. ERA Economics helping with the feasibility analysis and economics parts of the plans. We have Ag Innovations and the Freshwater Trust and the Local Government Commission all collaborating on education and outreach and facilitation of all these various meetings with all the various stakeholders. All right, next slide, please. Okay, here's our schedule. So we've been working on this plan, as I said, for a while now, and it's all coming together quite quickly. As I said earlier, sections 1 through 4 and 7 are up on the website. The collaborative actually just got section 5 a few days ago, and then we're going to get sections 6, 8, and 9 probably in the next month or so. What we're hoping is to have a complete draft out this fall, maybe end of October. Please check it out. Again, go to our website, start reading draft sections of the plan. We really value your input. We want to make sure that all the stakeholders understand what we're doing and that we're going in the right direction. And if not, we'd like to hear about it now so that we can kind of correct the ship before we get too far down that pathway. And then as we get towards the end of the year, we're going to have another virtual town hall meeting such as this, again, to showcase the entire GSP. The various GSAs, their boards, and the city councils are going to have to adopt the GSP in December, and then we're actually going to have to submit it to DWR before January or on January 31st of next year. And again, we're hoping that if you can review sections of the plan as they come out, or even in October, that we don't get any red flags, or if you have some issues or concerns, let us know so that we can try to address those as soon as possible. And this is going to be a living document. You know, it's not a static thing. As new information comes in, as new analysis is being done, we're going to be doing annual reports, and then we're going to be doing bigger 5-year updates. So there's going to be a continual process of giving your input and really listening to what stakeholders have to say so that we can really get the best plan in place as possible. Next slide, please. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to be turning it over to Emily at the Local Government Commission, who's going to be talking about how you can provide input.
Me now, and it's great to see such a big group. I think it shows just how important this conversation is today. I'm really grateful for you all spending time with us this evening. As Chris mentioned, the Local Government Commission has been partnering with the Ag Innovations team over the last 3 years now to gather input from stakeholders through surveys, interviews, and public meetings. And our work at the Local Government Commission in partnership with the Freshwater Trust has really been focused on engaging groundwater dependent, vulnerable communities and disadvantaged communities across the subbasin. Our teams at Ag Innovations and LGC have heard many questions and concerns and feedback from the community that's been really, really valuable in informing this planning process. For example, at the 2019 virtual town hall, some of our participants raised concerns about the northwest area of the subbasin. And since then, our project team has really taken those concerns to heart and considered ways to address some of those concerns in the GSP itself, including in the proposed projects and management actions. And Vicki from the Ludorf and Scalamini team will be touching more on that later tonight. Another concern that we heard was specifically focused on drinking water quality. And while the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act does address water quality in a limited way, there are a number of other agencies and regulations that are responsible for ensuring the subbasin's water quality. In response to those concerns, LGC hosted a virtual drinking water forum last winter to provide an overview of drinking water in the subbasin and how it's managed, addressing some common questions that we had heard about drinking water and what Sigma does and doesn't speak to when it comes to tap water. And then we also brought in some of our local and state agency partners to discuss some resources and tools related to monitoring your drinking water. And we can share information from that drinking water forum, including all the recordings and materials from that event with you all. And water quality continues to be a priority in the GSP and something that Vicki will also touch on later tonight. Next slide, if you can. Great, thank you. We also saw just a broader need for understanding groundwater. As Chris said, it's a very technical topic, and this legislation is incredibly technical as well. So to address that broader educational need, LGC and the Freshwater Trust and the Solano Resource Conservation District have been working on a number of educational tools and resources, including a groundwater education program that's been delivered both in person and virtually in classes across the subbasin. We've also developed a bilingual groundwater guide website, which we can share in the chat now, that has a number of tools and resources about Sigma. And then hot off the press, we just finalized a bilingual video of community members sharing what groundwater stewardship means to them. And we have Chris featured in the video sharing a little bit more about Sigma. So we'd love to see you all circulate those to your neighbors and friends and others. And we'll make sure those links are shared in the chat. And with that, I will turn things back over to Amy.
Thanks, Emily. Okay. So I just am gonna review the ways that you can be involved in the GSP process, as we're gonna continue to reiterate because it's so important. So first is this is the summer virtual town hall meeting. There will be another one likely in the fall in November. I think we haven't set the exact date, but we're working on it. The Community Advisory Committee is someplace that we go into a lot of the topics that we present here at town hall meetings, and we go in a little bit deeper. So a lot of what we talk about this evening at our next Community Advisory Committee, which is going to be on September 23rd, we'll go a bit deeper into some of these topics. The GSA board meetings are a great way to stay connected with your GSA. So we encourage you can go to the solanogsp.com and all the GSA board meeting dates and times are there. Also to review and comment on the GSP. So again, we'll continue to direct you to the Solano GSP website. And we've tried to make the process really, really easy as possible anyways. And it's critical. It's a really critical way for you to make sure that your thinking and your voice is heard and integrated into the GSP. So if you haven't already, you can go to the Solano website, Solano GSP website, and see the parts of the GSP that have been released so far and give your comments there. And the groundwater guide, as Emily discussed, is an excellent resource about groundwater in the Solano subbasin. So those are ways to get connected and stay involved. Can't stress enough how much it matters to this process that you stay engaged. And last, before we hand it over to Vicki for the core of this process, I'm just going to launch one poll, and it really helps while we're talking about getting connected to know how you heard about this event. So I'm going to launch this. If you could let us know, it really helps us direct the resources that we have to the kind of outreach that really matters and makes a difference. So if you could select how you heard about this event, was it through the Solano GSP newsletter, a newspaper website, Facebook, other social media, other kinds of public events? Maybe it was word of mouth or something else entirely. If it was other, we'll give you a moment to share more about that in just a second. So I'm seeing lots of great. We've got about 38%. Would love if you could just respond. Again, how'd you hear about this event? This helps us know how to direct our outreach for future events and make every dollar count. So I'll just give it another few seconds and I'll just share the results. It is all anonymous, just so you know. But yeah, so you can see quite a few people through the GSP newsletter and some others. So we would love to know if you found out about it in another way. If you could put that, actually, I closed the chat. Susanna, can you open the chat again for a moment?
It is open now.
Okay, great. If you could put that in the chat, if you selected other on this poll, can you let us know how it was that you heard about this? That would be really helpful for us to know in the future. Okay, so we'll just leave that open for a second, and then we'll reclose the chat in a moment. Again, that's great for you to let us know. And with that, I am going to pass it over to you, Vicki, who's going to review some of the key concepts and terms and then share about the groundwater conditions in the Solano subbasin. Thanks. Over to you, Vicki.
We really appreciate everybody's attendance tonight. Next slide, Amy. Thanks. As Chris mentioned, there's one groundwater sustainability plan for the entire Solano subbasin, and we're fortunate to have that. Next slide. There are four major components that comprise the groundwater sustainability plan, and tonight we're going to be focusing on the status of overall groundwater conditions, the water resources being used and managed in the subbasin, and the overall groundwater sustainability. Next slide. And as we get started, we'll go over two really key Sustainable Groundwater Management Act terms. And the essence of SGMA really is described by these two key terms on the slide. The sustainability goal: the plan achieves sustainable groundwater management by implementing measures to ensure that the basin is operated within the sustainable yield. The sustainable yield being the other really key term. It's the maximum quantity of water that's calculated over a base period, and that means that representative long-term conditions in the basin and including any temporary surplus. And we're looking at what can be withdrawn annually without causing an undesirable result. Next slide. An undesirable result, a key part of that prior term, this refers to one or more of the following effects caused by groundwater conditions that are occurring throughout the subbasin. And for these 6 sustainability indicators that are shown on this slide, the groundwater basin needs to be managed in a manner that's to avoid significant and unreasonable effects, including groundwater level decline, reduction in groundwater storage, groundwater degradation, water quality degradation, seawater intrusion, land subsidence, and stream flow depletion. These terms, significant and unreasonable, those are not defined in the GSP regulations. So it's really important, that we are sharing the information with stakeholders and receiving your input on what constitutes significant and unreasonable. Next slide. So in the upcoming slides, we're going to talk about overall groundwater conditions in the subbasin. And this relates to the work that's preceded all of this time, what Chris mentioned about large technical memorandums and the sections that have been developed to date. Next slide. The water resources in the subbasin, they play a critical role in the economy and the viability of local interests. And fortunately, for more than a half century, since 1959, the subbasin has benefited from the leadership and foresight that resulted in the construction and use of the Solano Water Project to provide surface water for use with groundwater to meet water demands in the subbasin. There are groundwater shortages that were recognized as early as the 1900s. And at that time, the Solano County Board of Supervisors appointed a water council in 1940 to promote water development and to study local water needs. By the 1950s, it was recognized that another source of water supply was really important for the county's future. And this is when the construction of the Solano project began in 1953. So essentially before 1960, before the Solano project, most water needs were met by using groundwater. And then following the construction of the project, surface water use greatly increased and supplemental surface water was provided to farmlands and groundwater use decreased. As we'll go over later in this presentation, the foresight that led to the use of surface water and concurrently decreased the reliance on groundwater, that led to recovery of groundwater levels, and that began the conjunctive use in the basin, and it reversed the decline that had occurred with groundwater levels before the project came online. Next slide. One of the requirements for the groundwater sustainability plan is to develop a hydrogeologic conceptual model for this subbasin. And this type of model refers to a descriptive model that uses physical data and groundwater and surface water quality and quantity measurements to characterize the physical components of the subsurface, and particularly how water moves into and out of the system, and especially including the interaction of surface water and groundwater systems in the subbasin. This hydrogeologic conceptual model serves a lot of purposes, including it provides the physical basis for local numerical model development, which we'll get into later, and understanding groundwater conditions and trends in the subbasin, and also informing approaches for potential projects and management actions that are developed to ensure future sustainability and are implemented as needed. A key component of this hydrogeologic conceptual model is the construction of cross sections, geologic cross sections, which I'll also show an example of in the next slide. We've constructed 15 of these geologic cross sections, and these are located at the colored lines shown on the image in the center of the slide. Some of these cross sections include geologic conditions, materials extending to depths of over 2,500 feet deep. Next slide. So on this slide, imagine the cross sections that are shown on this map to represent a downward vertical slice through the earth. The image on the lower right-hand portion of the slide shows a pseudo 3D image, and it's the aerial view of where the Puda Creek flows from west to east. And then the front of this diagram is a slice looking into the earth. These cross sections are prepared using reports prepared by drilling contractors when they drill a well, and also it utilizes oil and gas geophysical logs. Those are the blue squiggly lines on this image to help us better understand the sediments in the subsurface, and particularly the nature of their texture, whether they're finer or coarser, and how those sediments are distributed. All of this information helps us characterize how groundwater occurs and moves in the subsurface, and what happens in response to natural or imposed conditions like pumping to purposely remove groundwater, or when it rains or when there's irrigation water applied. The large image shown here shows how alluvium, and that's referring to looser clays and sand and gravel deposits, and how as you move from the east to the west side of the subbasin, this alluvial deposit is thinning as we move to the west. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we're tracking and in the subsurface with monitoring systems are shallow responses of groundwater levels in shallower and deeper aquifers. When the when the Solano project came online, it played a large role in the use of surface water to meet water demands. So as you see where the groundwater levels by the darker blue line on this hydrograph that's showing the groundwater elevation over time, how it was lower in more historically back in the early 1960s, and then we see it rise. And that's in response to what occurred when the Solano project came online. Less groundwater used and more surface water was used. There are some exceptions to the generally stable groundwater levels across the Solano subbasin. And these are exceptions as was noted earlier by Emily about what we heard from stakeholders in previous meetings, where there are some water level declines that are noted in the far northwestern part of the subbasin. This can be due in part to geologic conditions, but also how wells are constructed in the geologic materials and other factors like new land uses or increased groundwater use in a localized area. Next slide. We're also looking at groundwater levels deeper in the groundwater system, and these levels are not necessarily coincident with those in the shallower part of the system. So it's really important that we're monitoring and tracking water levels at different depth horizons. Some wells in the subbasin pump from very deep parts of the groundwater system. An example of this is groundwater pumped by the city of Vacaville. This groundwater is pumped under confined conditions, meaning under pressure, and pumping from this part of the groundwater system does not influence groundwater levels completed in a much shallower part of the system. We've looked at responses to wells in both parts of the system and have not seen an influence of the city's pumping on shallower parts of the system. The groundwater produced from the deeper sediments largely occurs in the Vacaville area, and this was relocated or optimized around 2000 to spread that pumping out to the more northerly part of the basin. There was some decline, as is noted here on this hydrograph and where the arrow is pointing to. But as that new groundwater development occurred, groundwater levels that were under pressure showed a decrease for a period of time. And then you'll note that they stabilized after that and to the present. Next slide, please. The hydrographs that we're looking at on this slide, they're for wells that are completed in the more upper part of the groundwater system. And the wells here range in depth from about 100 feet to 400 feet. For many of these wells, groundwater level declines are present, and these are apparent. And since 2010, many of you have recognized that there have been many dry years that have occurred since that time. In more recent years, there has been some recovery that has occurred in response to wetter years. But here we are again, last year and this year, back to back, facing very dry years. Recovery of water levels hasn't occurred for all the wells, and you can see this especially in the well in the middle of this panel and on the left side of the image. And this is a well that's primarily completed in a deeper part of the Tehama Formation and also near the perimeter of the subbasin. So those are conditions that are related to the geology and where that water is produced from, and where it has difficulty receiving replenishment even during wetter years. Next slide, please. This slide is comparing differences that we've tracked between groundwater levels in two different time frames. So we're comparing what was monitored during spring 1988, and then comparing that to groundwater levels collected in spring 2018. Over this 30-year period, we see that much of the subbasin has shown little change or even some increases in groundwater levels, where we see the light tan to purples, that's what's occurring. However, as noted earlier, there is an area, particularly in the northwestern portion of the subbasin, this medium brown color that's showing a decrease in groundwater levels. And we're referring to this as a northwestern focus area of the subbasin, and we'll come back to that. Next slide, please. So in addition to tracking groundwater level trends, measurements to track the elevation of the land surface are really important to monitoring changes to detect potential land subsidence. Satellite data, such as what we're showing here, that is received from continuous global positioning system measurements that are essentially real-time continuous measurements. Those and other technologies are used to measure land surface elevation changes. What we're referring to in an acronym, the CGPS data collected and displayed here as time series graphs are from 4 stations that are located in the Solano subbasin. And we're highlighting a couple of these in yellow. One is at the Vacaville station in the upper left-hand corner of this image. And then another one referred to as the P267 station in the lower part of the image. These CGPS data for Vacaville station were collected between 2012 and 2020, and they show an overall land surface elevation change of only 0.0067 feet per year, so a very tiny amount. Similarly, there's the other station, the P267 station, and this is data collected between 2005 and 2020. And again, an overall land surface elevation change, very small, 0.0131 feet per year. These are essentially a fraction of an inch, less than 0.2 of an inch per year. What's important that we're particularly looking for in terms of any kind of concerns in the future is inelastic land surface subsidence. And at those minute levels, that's not necessarily inelastic land subsidence. Next slide, please. In addition to characterizing groundwater level trends in the subbasin, as Emily mentioned, we're also characterizing groundwater quality. These are just a couple of examples of constituents of interest, and we're showing here nitrate on the left and total dissolved solids on the right-hand side of the image. Nitrate has a regulated state drinking water limit of 10 milligrams per liter, and that's in order to be safe for drinking. The image shows where these constituents have been measured in wells, and the maximum concentrations of both of these constituents are shown in colors. So while most wells have data that show nitrate levels below the drinking water standard, and that includes all the colors except for red, there are a number of locations, particularly in the northeastern part of the subbasin, that show locations where nitrate exceeds the drinking water limit. So this is something that we're wanting to track and watch over time. Switching to total dissolved solids, which is a measure of salinity. In this case, the recommended state secondary maximum contaminant level at that standard, which is set on the basis of aesthetic concerns such as taste. That standard is 500 milligrams per liter, and most of the wells in the subbasin show concentrations lower than 750, which is an upper limit, below an upper limit of 1,000. The colors in orange and red on this part of on the TDS slide are levels that exceed 750 milligrams per liter. So in both cases, we're watching what current conditions are and how those may be affected by groundwater management, and particularly any projects and management actions that may be implemented in areas of the subbasin in the future. Next slide, please. A really important aspect of the groundwater sustainability plan development is characterizing surface water and groundwater interconnections and assessing the potential for effects of groundwater Okay. So one of the activities in the subbasin related to this characterization of surface water and groundwater interconnections is a project that, as Chris mentioned, is being conducted in collaboration with the University of California at Davis. And that project has involved evaluating surface water and groundwater connectivity, especially near Puda Creek, and has included the installation of many monitoring wells near Puda Creek and in the northwestern area of the subbasin. There's also about to begin in the next month some additional drilling supported by the Department of Water Resources on dedicated Sigma related monitoring wells, and those are also positioned adjacent to Puda Creek. These groundwater level data will be used to evaluate spatial and seasonal differences in depths to groundwater, and they help provide information on ecological habitats also. Next slide, please. Important beneficial users, and that's a key term mentioned earlier by folks, that the beneficial users of groundwater in the subbasin aren't just the people. Beneficial users also include the plants and the animals and natural communities that rely on groundwater to meet all or even a portion of their water needs. And all of these together are referred to as groundwater dependent ecosystems, or you may hear the acronym GDEs sometimes. This is a map that's showing where critical habitat has been mapped by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And it shows where there are key areas in the subbasin that are important habitats to support fish and vegetation and other animals. Another really key stakeholder during the development of all the GSPs that are going on in the state, and including the Solano subbasin, is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. During the GSP development process, they're especially wanting to ensure that the measures taken and described in the GSPs are meeting the needs of fish and wildlife, as well as attending to the use of groundwater by domestic well owners and others. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we're summing up a lot of what I just described about kind of an overview of groundwater conditions in the subbasin. And this is showing what we're seeing in the current status, or what we'll refer to as the health of groundwater conditions. Each of the sustainability indicators that we referred to briefly at the beginning are shown here, and they're all generally in a good or better than good condition. But there are local areas, as I've mentioned, that do need attention. They're not representative of the entire subbasin, but they are areas that need attention, and one of those is that northwestern focus area. There are also areas where there are pre-existing, before the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was adopted, so pre-existing groundwater quality conditions. It's not really the role of the GSAs to correct those pre-existing conditions. However, it's really important as part of future groundwater management actions that the management of the subbasin not contribute to groundwater quality degradation. It's also recognized that additional data and monitoring that is conducted as part of GSP implementation will further inform the understanding of groundwater conditions, and it will also inform future groundwater management actions. Next slide, please. So in the next several slides, we're going to talk about the water budget in the subbasin. And it includes actually not just surface water system water budget, which this transition slide mentions, but actually focuses on the integrated hydrologic modeling that has gone on. Nick Watterson and some others in our office have been deeply engaged in working on the integrated hydrologic model. Next slide. So why do we need a groundwater flow model for the Solano subbasin? Groundwater flow models are particularly useful for supporting many of the things that are required to be included in the groundwater sustainability plan. Models are really simplifications of super complex processes that occur on the surface and subsurface of the earth. So there's always going to be some uncertainty associated with model results, but it's important because there's so many different mechanisms going on, so many different spatial and temporal variables, that having a modeling tool is helpful for us to do the computations necessary to develop historical and current and future water budgets, and to be used to inform decision-making about monitoring networks. Where do we need more monitoring? How do we make monitoring networks better? And how they can, all this information can be used to help establish sustainable management criteria. Through the construction and calibration of this numerical flow model, we can improve our understanding of all these different processes that influence the 6 sustainability indicators that I described, such as groundwater level declines and surface water depletions. The flow model can also be used to simulate climate change conditions. This is a requirement in the GSP regulations for an over 50-year planning and implementation horizon. And then models can also be used to determine what happens in response, what happens in the groundwater system in response to future changes, such as climate change, and what kinds of management actions need to be implemented in order to avoid those undesirable results that we referred to, and to ultimately achieve ongoing sustainability. Next slide, please. So in this schematic on the slide, we're showing the surface water and groundwater flowing into and out of our groundwater system. These are all the things that are being accounted for as part of the overall subbasin water budget. The inflows into the system, schematically shown here, include rainwater and irrigation water and groundwater. That irrigation water including both surface water and groundwater applied to the land surface for irrigation. Stream flow and runoff coming into the subbasin and providing water that can infiltrate into the subsurface. And then groundwater also flowing into the subbasin from the hillsides or also from adjacent subbasins. Those flows can go both ways. There's also outflows that are from the evapotranspiration from plants. There can be stream flow leaving the subbasin, groundwater flowing out of the subbasin. There's an area of exchange between surface water and groundwater systems where surface water can percolate into the subsurface and recharge groundwater, or groundwater can discharge or move into stream systems and provide a component of the overall flow of the stream. When you think of a water budget, think of it like a bank account. We look at how much is being deposited, meaning the inflows, and we can subtract how much is being withdrawn, meaning the outflows. And this is to compute the amount that's still remaining in reserve. And we refer to this reserve as the change in the groundwater storage. Next slide, please. So the team has been working on the development of what we are referring to the local Solano integrated hydrologic model. As shown on this image, the model area extends well beyond the subbasin boundary to the north and the east and the south and the southwest. So outside of the colored area of the image, and where you see the black and white kind of shapes, elements, that is the entirety of the whole model area. And this model initially derived from one that was created by the Department of Water Resources for the entire Sacramento River watershed area. We've locally refined it with local land and water use, and also added locally important streams that weren't represented in the DWR model, and also updated hydrogeologic information. Following model calibration, some of the key outputs that we're looking at are groundwater level, and also water budget components for historical and future periods. And we've prepared water budgets for each of the groundwater sustainability agency areas, and also for the subbasin on the whole. In the upcoming slides, we're going to summarize a few of the results for the entire subbasin. Next slide, please. So key components of the water budget, using that schematic that I referred to a moment ago, and now we're showing some of the results for the historical water budget period that span the time frame from 1991 to 2018. And we're showing the largest inflow to the subbasin is deep percolation of over 200,000 acre feet per year. There's also a large outflow of groundwater extractions or pumping of 181,000 acre feet per year. There's other components, small subsurface inflow from the hillsides or upland areas. There is net stream seepage, which is important in and out of streams, with most of the flow into the groundwater system of 14,000 acre feet per year. And then also flow leaving in the subsurface, groundwater flow going to adjacent basins. And that's a net of 36,000 acre feet per year. And that's going to various subbasins surrounding the Solano subbasin. Overall, the most important thing here is we are showing a positive change in groundwater storage, meaning that there's an increase in the amount of groundwater that we have in reserve as we look at that groundwater storage over this historical period of time. And that's 2,900 acre feet per year. Next slide, please. So we also want to look at the future land use and including climate change. And this is for the 2022 to 2072 subbasin water budget. This includes key components again on average annual basis for this period. The largest inflow being deep percolation and 190,000 acre feet per year. And the largest outflow being groundwater extraction of about 185,000 acre feet per year. And again, we have some other smaller flows, small flow from the uplands area, an increase in the net stream seepage here to 55,000 acre feet per year, and a larger amount of groundwater flowing to adjacent basins, a net of 63,000 acre feet per year. But again, even with future land use and also climate change, we're looking at a positive change in groundwater storage, not quite as large as the one that I just mentioned, but still a positive change in storage of 800 acre feet per year. Next slide, please. So here we're returning to the Northwest focus area that I described earlier that's exhibited some localized groundwater level declines. And similar to the water budget analyses conducted for the entire subbasin, and as I mentioned, also for the GSAs, we can also look at water budgets for focused areas such as this. So in the next slide, we're looking at water budget components for this particular area, and we're comparing what that looks like as the average annual change in storage, where we've circled all the columns with that aqua blue circle around it. And here it compares what that looks like for the historical period from 1991 to 2018, but also under current land use and future land use out 50 years and future land use also with climate change. And what we're seeing over all these different kinds of scenarios is a slight decrease in groundwater storage on an average annual basis. It's ranging from a little over 100 acre feet per year to a little over 300 acre feet per year. So while this is a quite small change in a single year, relative to those other volumes that I was just speaking about, when we accumulate this over a long period of time, it warrants more attention. And so in coming slides, after we take a pause here, we're going to circle back on this and talk about some of the projects and management actions that are being examined to look at what might be implemented to ensure sustainability. I believe that brings us to a transition, and we'll pause there.
Yes, thanks, Vicki. Okay, yeah, we're going to give just a moment for folks. There are some, if you're not following along, there's some great questions being answered in the Q&A box. So just want to direct people there that some of the other folks, other attendees are asking, which are great questions, both about like, what does it really mean to have no loss pumping, for there to be no loss unless there is no pumping, and Nick's offering some explanation there. And what is the source of the 190,000 acre feet per year of deep percolation water? So Nick, thanks so much for answering those questions. I do want to open it up to, we have time for probably one, potentially two folks to ask a question out loud, and then we're going to launch a little poll so we can get lots of feedback at once. If anybody has a burning question that you'd like, we can unmute you and you can ask it. So this is where you're gonna raise your, I'm raising my physical hand, but you're gonna raise your electronic hand. You can move the mouse on your screen, and there at the bottom, there's a raise hand icon. So if you do have a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand and we can call on you. And if there are no questions in that form, well, then we'll just move on to the poll. So I'll give you a second to decide if anybody has a question. Okay, I know it can be kind of intimidating. Oh, there is somebody, let's see. Yes, Marcy. Okay, we're going to allow you to talk. I think, is that Marcy? I think you should be unmuted. Can you hear us, Marcy? You might have to unmute on your side. And you might not be maybe in a language channel. So you might need to be in a language channel for us to hear you. Okay. We can't hear you. All right, so maybe we can try again with you, Marcy. Is there anybody else that has a question? And Marcy, if you can always type it into the Q&A. I'm sorry to miss you in this way. We just can't seem to get your audio. Is anybody else hearing her? No, okay. All right, well, we tried. We'll try again, Marcy. We'll see if we can sort it out on the back end. And we'll just go ahead and launch this poll. So for this one, we're actually going to use something called Slido. And it's a way for us to be able to get a little bit more information than what we can do in a Zoom poll. So I'm going to share my screen, and there's going to be some directions that you have to leave Zoom for just a moment. And one second. So present this. I'm going to share my screen over here. All right, so you should see, are you seeing the Slido? Can somebody who I can see? Yes, great, thanks for nodding, Chris. So you'll join at slido.com, and when you get there, you'll be asked to enter in a code. And so you don't have to put in the hash mark, but you'll do 2 GSP. That means the second poll for this GSP related conversation. So slido.com and go to 2 and enter in 2 GSP. And my team from Ag Innovations will put that in the chat as well. And if you're on your smartphone, you can also scan this QR code, and that's another way just to launch the poll. Okay, so the first question is, are you surprised by what you just heard about the groundwater conditions in the Solano subbasin? So it's really helpful for us to know how this is landing on the community. Is it surprised? Did you already have a sense of this information? It's completely new. So the first one is, I'm not at all surprised by this information. I'm very surprised by this information, is the second one. And I'm somewhat surprised by this information. So I'm not at all surprised, somewhat surprised, very surprised. I will just give you a moment to make your way over to Slido and to enter in this first question. Again, if you need to, you'll go to slido.com and enter in when it asks for a code 2 GSP. And all of this is anonymous. We will ask for folks, if you want to in a little while, some relevant questions for you to share your contact information, but this is all anonymous. So feel free to answer as honestly as you're able. I've seen that 18 of you so far have replied. I'm going to leave it open for a few more minutes because let's see, there are 89 participants, and we would love for as many of you as possible to answer these questions. And there's going to be some more that are content related in just a moment. Give it another couple seconds.
And if you click directly on the link on the chat for the Slido link, you won't have to enter any code. It will take you directly to the actual poll. So please take a look at the chat and join us there.
Great. Thanks, Lupe. Trying to make it as easy on you as possible so we can get your input. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next question here. So that means this one will stop and we'll start another one. So give it a couple more seconds. Once I change the question, you won't be able to answer this one anymore. Okay, second question. Does the information about the groundwater conditions in the Solano subbasin match your on-the-ground experience? So for the first one, yes, the information in my experience seemed the same. Maybe sort of. Some of the information matches my experience, but not all. And no, my on-the-ground experience is much different than the information provided. So again, it's really helpful for us to know if your lived experience is matching what we're finding with the data. This is a way of literally ground truthing and groundwater truthing and getting a sense of what you guys know. Okay, great. So it seems like about 57%, yes, the information seems the same, and some sort, and that's great to know. If there's anybody else that's a no, my on-the-ground experience is much different, please share. It's helpful information. But so far it seems either yes or sort of, wow, neck and neck. It's almost like watching a little race happen. This is great. So I'm going to close this again in the next few seconds. There's 32 folks. If anybody else wants to make your way over to the Slido poll and chime in, we'd love it. Okay. All right, so I'm going to close this one. And the last, if the information does not match your on-the-ground experience, please describe how and where you see a difference. So I'm going to leave this open for just a moment. And I want to say too that if I close this, we're just so we can move on to the next part of the discussion. Before you're done, we'd love to hear where the information that we're sharing in your lived experience aren't matching up. And you can always email us at info@aginnovations.org. So that's another option. So matches and NA, this is good. Yeah, so you really only have to answer that if it doesn't match your on-the-ground experience. It seemed like there was 3%, just to maybe a couple people if it doesn't match. We'd love to hear from you either here or else at another time, that's okay too, just so we can get some of that information to see what you see. The nitrate levels seem higher on the survey. Great, it matches my expectations. Great. Okay, well, I'm going to stop this poll. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. I'm just checking my notes, making sure there's nothing else I'm supposed to say. All right, I'm going to stop my share and pass it back over to you, Vicki, the sustainable management criteria and projects and management actions. Perfect.
Okay, thanks everybody. And we are interested to hear more about what was surprising or not surprising, or what's your experience or different from your experience. So in the following slides, these are going to be examples of the types of conditions that could be considered undesirable for the Solano subbasin, and why monitoring and assessing sustainability indicators are so important to achieving the sustainability goal for the subbasin. So in this first slide, this Sigma is filled with terms and a lot of jargon. And so I'll spend just a minute here describing some of the terms to help you understand the language. Sustainability goal we touched on earlier. It's when the basin is managed within its sustainable yield and through the implementation of a groundwater sustainability plan. So these are really important connections between what we're trying to achieve with the goal and what it means for the sustainable yield. The sustainable yield being met through the avoidance of undesirable results. And within the GSP regulations, that's 6 sustainability indicators. However, in the Solano subbasin, we're focusing on 5 of these indicators, not including seawater intrusion. There is not a direct connection between the Solano subbasin and the bay or the saltwater. There's no saltwater freshwater interface. However, we are looking at groundwater quality and where there can be effects, potentially in the future tidally. So we're looking at 5 indicators. Sigma requires that agencies establish a sustainability goal and then develop and implement the plan to meet that goal by avoiding undesirable results as are measured quantitatively for all of these sustainability indicators. And all of this occurs through a stakeholder process, like this, in order to accomplish sustainable management in 20 years or less, as the case may be. Oops. So the first one that we're going to touch on is the undesirable result, chronic lowering of groundwater levels, and when that could become significant and unreasonable. And this would be if groundwater conditions in the subbasin result in prolonged year-to-year reductions in groundwater levels below levels that have been recorded historically. We want to avoid groundwater level declines in domestic wells that affect the capacity of those wells to produce water. And we also want to avoid groundwater level declines that could affect groundwater dependent ecosystems that I mentioned earlier. So not just effects on people, also effects on ecologic communities. Another sustainability indicator is looking at the avoidance of reductions of groundwater storage. And this could become significant and unreasonable if conditions in the subbasin result in groundwater storage reductions that exceed that important term, the subbasin sustainable yield. So we're looking at potentially not those years that are drought years. However, if we're trying to account for drought conditions, that's okay, but it's only okay as long as the basin is managed to recover in non-drought years. So similar to chronic groundwater level decline, we need to avoid groundwater level declines in domestic wells that affect the capacity of those wells to produce water. And again, we also want to avoid groundwater level declines or storage changes that would affect groundwater dependent ecosystems. With land subsidence, this would become really significant and unreasonable if groundwater conditions changed in the subbasin that resulted in permanent, and as I mentioned before, we're talking about inelastic subsidence, and it's inelastic subsidence that occurs to agree that it disrupts or causes accelerated damage to important public or private infrastructure like roads or railway, bridges, or water supply infrastructure. In this case, we're certainly not wanting to wait until conditions approach that kind of significant and unreasonable condition. So this is where we'd be looking to use those stations that I mentioned earlier, continuous global positioning stations, and also other data like satellite data that's provided by NASA through DWR to look at whether inelastic subsidence is occurring. It's also looking at things like groundwater levels. So there's a whole host of different kinds of data that can be evaluated together to determine whether or not it's inelastic subsidence and to what degree it may be occurring. And these are metrics that would be used especially to establish that there's potentially some significant change that is occurring long before any unreasonable condition ever occurs. Another sustainability indicator is degraded water quality. And this would become significant and unreasonable if, as a result of the actions by a GSA or more than one GSA, translate to water quality that becomes degraded. So this is could be as a result of projects or management actions. If it's in an area where it mobilizes pre-existing contaminants, and if the water quality starts to degrade to a concentration where it no longer meets state or federal standards, or if it negatively affects the suitability of the use of groundwater for beneficial uses. So we're wanting to ensure that groundwater quality doesn't become degraded due to actions by the GSAs during their efforts to keep the basin sustainable. Baseline water quality is established as part of the many analyses that have been done for the development of the GSP. And this is included and is posted online in a very large technical memorandum on the hydrogeologic conceptual model and also groundwater conditions. And there's a corresponding section of the GSP that's also posted online. One of the things that we're recommending to do is establish trigger levels. And these would be concentrations that are less than the regulatory limits for such constituents as nitrate and arsenic. So concentrations that are, say, on the order of 75% below the maximum contaminant level, the regulatory limit, so that we can identify when a concern may be developing well prior to it becoming a significant and unreasonable condition. And this isn't the only thing. It doesn't mean that the GSAs aren't constantly looking at, what's collected on an annual basis, looking at those data, comparing it to the metrics that are established as part of the sustainable management criteria for the subbasin. And then another really important sustainability indicator is the depletion of stream flow. So in this case, an example is surface water depletions that would become in the category of significant and unreasonable if, as a result of groundwater extraction, the timing or duration of the connectivity between groundwater and surface water is reduced relative to what is documented historically. Or another thing that would be important to look at is whether surface water flow volumes or rates are reduced. If there's a rate of depletion that causes the flow volume or the rate of flow in the stream system to be reduced as a result of groundwater extraction, and that is as compared to historical conditions. So we're trying to avoid an increase in stream depletion due to groundwater extraction in the future. In the case of Puda Creek has gone through a large amount of historical analyses resulting in legal actions and creating the Puda Creek Accord, which is a regulatory document. And so here it would be maintaining the flows as they have been maintained historically since that was put in place. So compliance with that document, the Puda Creek Accord, would be maintained. So as we look at all of these sustainability indicators, all 5 of them, Sigma, the GSP regulations, they require that quantitative metrics be established. And these include what are referred to as the minimum threshold. This is a measure not to be exceeded in order to avoid undesirable results. And here we're showing on the image, the red line highlighting that as a minimum threshold. An example that's shown here is relative to groundwater elevations. So it would be trying to establish what elevation that is not to be exceeded at what location within the subbasin in order to avoid the specific undesirable result that we're trying to avoid. The measurable objective is another quantitative measure, and this is set to maintain or improve groundwater conditions that achieve the overall sustainability goal for the basin. This is shown schematically on this example here for groundwater elevations, where we're looking at a higher value of an elevation. And it's one that at many locations in the Solano subbasin, we may already seeing that on average. It's looked at as an average over a range of historically occurring or what we would want to occur. In the case of other subbasins, critically overdrafted basins that have already needed to or required to submit their groundwater sustainability plans in January 2020, They were looking at a measurable objective to be achieved. In the case of Solano Subbasin, it's largely a measure that we want to either maintain or even improve upon with projects and management actions. This slide is just showing examples of all the types of metrics to be established for each of these sustainability indicators, including both measurable objectives and the minimum thresholds that I just described. And for each of these, it's then showing, the different kinds of metrics that may be established. So it can be elevations for the lowering of groundwater levels, or it may be volumes for reduction in groundwater storage. Seawater, as I mentioned, is not applicable here for the Solano Subbasin. Degraded water quality, we're looking more at key constituents as a concentration, and then land subsidence, we'd be looking at a rate. So as we go to the next handful of slides, we're going to look at some of the projects and management actions that have been examined by the Solano GSA Collaborative, all of the GSAs working together, and also with input from each of the GSAs and their boards of directors and constituency. So within SGMA and GSP regulations, there are requirements for projects and management actions. These are tools that are developed to help maintain or achieve groundwater sustainability. And this is particularly important as we look ahead to future changes in land or water uses, and also climate change and changing groundwater conditions. It's pretty hard for us to look in a crystal ball and really see what it is that we may be facing. So we're wanting to be prepared. We're wanting to be able to achieve the sustainability goal and maintain sustainability in the subbasin. So there are key requirements for the projects and management actions that are described in the GSP. And these include a description of how projects and or management actions will achieve the sustainability goal, how they will be used to respond to potentially changing conditions in order to avoid undesirable results. There needs to be a description of any required permitting and regulatory processes. When they need to be implemented, should they need to be implemented, then there needs to be a timetable for how they would be initiated and how they would be completed. And especially important is a description of the intended benefits to be realized by the projects or management actions, and an estimate of the cost to do this. And importantly, we need to describe how these would, in the long term, achieve or maintain sustainability. So earlier in the presentation, I touched on groundwater levels and trends, and over the 30-year period from 1988 to 2018, we saw that much of the subbasin showed little change or even some increases in groundwater levels. However, as we also mentioned earlier, there is an area, that northwestern portion of the subbasin, that's showing a decrease in groundwater levels. And this helps inform approaches for projects to replenish the groundwater system or to potentially mitigate effects of dry years in the future. So we looked at this area as an area of interest for examining recharge opportunities in particular. And we're looking at storm flows or flood flows that could be captured when they're available and could be intentionally used for recharging the groundwater system. For example, flood flows from creeks in the area, particularly off to the western side of the subbasin. They may have surplus flows during wet years that could be captured and retained and purposely recharged on agricultural lands. When we intentionally pump groundwater for use, we also want to understand how the groundwater system can be replenished. And this map is showing areas where the soils and land surface conditions have physical characteristics that are conducive to providing recharge to the groundwater system. So the green areas on this map show where there's a better opportunity for recharge to occur, and the red areas show where there's a poorer potential for recharge. It's also useful as we're seeking out these potential areas to consider projects or management actions. We'd really like to look at those areas that have pre-existing conveyance structures so we can readily capture and move surplus stormwater onto the lands that are suitable for recharge. Overall, the northwestern focus area that we were highlighting earlier generally has excellent recharge potential. So as we look at this slide, there's examples of potential projects that can be implemented to augment replenishment of the groundwater system. And this includes a whole host of things, including developing projects to capture and use surplus stormwater or floodwater, focusing on suitable areas and the right physical characteristics. But amongst all of this, we really want to hear from landowners, local landowner concerns, and whether there's concerns about potentially detrimental effects that could result from retaining surplus water on fields, what you would like to see, if you're interested in the opportunity to recharge water and to be part of the ensuring sustainability of the subbasin, but what you see as a landowner as the best ways to go about that. So we're really seeking landowner interest and input, and we really want to hear from you. And that brings us to the end. We really want to thank everyone for attending, and I know Amy's got another poll here coming up, and we appreciate your attention and interest in all that we're trying to talk about tonight, and especially get your input on.
Yes, thanks so much, Vicki. And really appreciating the questions that are coming in, and Chris and Nick for attending to those. I do want to just actually see if Nick, you want to speak to, there are two that I'm tracking. We have a few extra minutes. If you want to just share out loud with folks, there's this question here about the flows of groundwater and if there are barriers in some places and how it kind of works. If you could just give a high level understanding or explanation of what is the structure of the subbasin. I know that Vicki's spoken to it a bit, but there's this question from Carl here. Are there barriers to flows from one area of the subbasin or to another, and how does that sort of affect things? Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question, and I appreciate it. And so I think I'll just say that, so the question was, are there, I think Amy summarized it well. Are there barriers to flow within the subbasin? I think, and so what we can think of, there's barriers, there's both lateral barriers and then also vertical barriers. And so in the terms of, from a sense of lateral barriers, within the subbasin, there are some faults that occur in the area. They're not understood or believed, and there's no data to suggest that they are major impediments to the lateral movement of water. And then across subbasin boundaries, there's also flow, and similarly, even though we've got these subbasin boundaries that are largely based off of some geopolitical considerations, those are also not barriers to flow laterally. But it is notable that vertically, we have a subsurface that has many different layers and thick sequences of clay that do prevent vertical movement of water in some areas. And that's particularly notable in what Vicki was describing, the difference in water levels that you see in the upper part of the system versus what you see down in the basal Tehama, down at 1,000 feet or a couple thousand feet, where they're just the water isn't communicating between those zones, and that's a function of robust clay layers that separate those hydraulically. So, and then of course, many folks who have drilled a well or experienced it, you see clays come in. They can come in an inch thick. They can come in many feet, hundreds of feet thick, and so they come even an aquifer that maybe we think of as primarily yielding water from sands or gravels or materials like that is filled with a lot of different clay lenses as well.
Great. Thanks, Nick. I appreciate just the further definition of what some of those, how the water is moving throughout the sub-basin,
Right.
laterally and vertically. One more question that I'm guessing that Herb here shared, thanks Herb, from the Community Advisory Committee as well, that I'm thinking is on many people's mind is drought. And so if you could just speak to, even just for a minute, how will drought be accommodated for in the thresholds, and how is what to some are concerned about unprecedented droughts that don't necessarily look like the last 50 years, but are new levels of drought, and if that's something that you're seeing or not, or just speak to that a little bit.
I mean, as far as unprecedented beyond what we've seen in the historical 50 years of record, I think that's, and beyond sort of the climate change, scenario guidance that DWR has provided, and overlaying that on top of the 50 years of historical hydrology. I would say that's to the extent to which that sort of, magnitude of drought outside of that realm of what we've seen in the last 50 years, might consider. I mean, it's notable that in Solano Subbasin, because of the Solano project, it's, and the fact that it's been a highly reliable source of water, across drought years and other years, that in contrast to some other areas, it buffers the effects of prolonged droughts. But we are looking at those projected scenarios to say, hey, what, under these future land use conditions, under this future climate change scenarios, what, and assuming that 50 years of hydrology of historical, were to occur, what would we anticipate, or, what does the model suggest might occur with water levels, and then account for that and consider that at least in how we design and set thresholds. So that's sort of what
Great.
things are.
Yeah, thanks, Nick.
help?
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm guessing drought's on many people's minds, so it's great just to hear a little bit more. Okay, there's more questions that we could absolutely dive into, but I want to give the mic over to Ben Wallace from the Freshwater Trust, who's going to share a little bit about, there are some other processes that are happening parallel to the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, and that some of these other organizations are working on that are still related. So Ben, if you're ready, I'm going to pass it over to you. Okay, great. And if you can share your screen whenever you're ready.
Good. So yes, I just wanted to take a couple minutes to share some of the tools that we're using to evaluate recharge opportunities on agricultural fields in the Solano Subbasin. So I work with the Freshwater Trust, and we've been working with the groundwater sustainability agencies and the planning team for a number of years. And we are developing, basically what we want to do is, when the plan is hopefully approved and accepted, we want to make sure that there's tools available to help the community, particularly farmers and organizations that work with farmers, to help keep the basin in a sustainable condition. And so again, we're the Freshwater Trust. We're actually based out of Portland, Oregon, but we have a Sacramento office, and we're a nonprofit organization. So we work on habitat and flow restoration. We've actually designed Clean Water Act trading programs, and we work on credit and compliance programs. So the work we've done in Solano County is particularly on agricultural fields, is look at NRCS-based practices such as cover cropping, irrigation upgrades, and new practices that are being developed relating to managed aquifer recharge. And we're looking at where can we optimize the use of these practices to benefit groundwater. And so what we've done is we've developed tools to help with the implementation of SGMA and implementation of the Groundwater Sustainability Plan once the plan is approved. And so I'm not going to go deep into this, but we've developed web maps that are based on ArcGIS, so people who maybe don't use highly sophisticated mapping tools would be able to access information about the subbasin. We've actually developed a scenario planning tool, which will be online, and which allows people to look, well, it allows the groundwater sustainability agencies to look at places in the basin where there are fields with opportunities for groundwater beneficial activities, and we're working on things relating to tracking and crediting groundwater as we go forward. And so to just give you a taste of what some of these tools look like, for example, we've done work to take publicly available information on crop types, and then we've done quality control and checked with local RCDs to make sure that the data that we're using is correct, so that we understand the fields that are being, the types of crops that are being grown on local fields. Then we use data such as the soil agricultural groundwater, well, the SAGB is the expression, and it's a soil agricultural groundwater banking index. We'll use tools like that to figure out where are the soils most likely to infiltrate surface water or precipitation into groundwater, so we can identify places that are suitable for what we call managed aquifer recharge. And then this connected with hydrogeologic information from the planning team and from the GSP can help us to get the best bang for our buck if we're trying to keep the basin sustainable by doing what we call distributed recharge actions, by creating incentives for farmers to recharge sort of excess water during the winter time to make sure that the basin is sustainable during when people need the water at lower, drier times of year. Moving on, other types of information. So for example, we have a practice that we've been working on called rainfall managed aquifer recharge. We call it RAINMAR. And so what we're doing is we're using that field database, and then we're using these infiltration databases, and we're setting up analyses to figure out where are the best places, field by field, where we could do a practice such as RAINMAR. And then we work that information through a cost scenario where we look at the net present costs of doing these practices, so that we could help groundwater sustainability agencies do these practices at where they could get the highest possible returns at the lowest possible cost. And so again, what I'm trying to do here is just, I want you to understand that when you hear about the Freshwater Trust and when you hear about different tools we're developing, such as the Solano agricultural scenario planning tool, this isn't some kind of parallel effort. We're working hand in glove with the groundwater sustainability plan to try to have tools that can make that plan be successful once it gets completed. And so I did want to give a shout out to the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, which has funded some of this work, as well as grants from Proposition 1 and Prop 68. And we've been working with the Solano County Water Agency and Ludorf Scalmanini Consulting Engineers and many, many local partners to develop these tools. So going forward, you may hear from us, you may hear about some of these tools, and we hope to share them and give people the opportunity to take a deeper dive. I just wanted to give you the flavor of the kinds of things we're working on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, it's really great to hear about all the different efforts that are going in to make both the plan itself and implementation a success. So appreciate that. Okay, so I'm gonna take over share. You can stop share whenever you get a second. And we're gonna go into our third and final poll. And so I'm gonna ask my team to once again put the Slido link into the chat. And then once we go through this poll, we'll have a little bit more time at the end for Q&A, I hope. But we really want to get this in because there's lots of great questions here that it's really helpful to have your input on. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So again, you can go to slido.com, and this time you'll enter 3GSP, or you can just click on the link that my team has put in the chat, slido.com and 3GSP, and that will take you to this poll. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So the first question is, what kind of water user are you? And you can select all that apply to you. And there are some that they kind of might seem strange that, for example, I use groundwater for drinking, eating, cooking, or bathing on a regular basis. I'm guessing that's most of you, but nevertheless, it's helpful to hear and get this data. And then, of course, are you an agricultural groundwater user? Maybe you own a residential well, or you're a city resident. There's surface water user, municipal well operator, maybe commercial water user. So you can go through here, public water system from a California Native American tribe, the local land use planners or groundwater monitoring agency, or maybe other. So there's lots of different options in here. If you could just take a moment to go through and again, select all that apply. It's really helpful for us to get a sense of who's here and what kind of water user you are. So that we know when we talk, tell the DWR and others, and so we can have your input. We know who we're tracking and who we've heard input from, what kind of users. It's really important that we hear from this full swath of users, groundwater users in the Solano subbasin. So this helps us know who we've left out and who we've actually connected with. So please, if you can, you'll come over to slido.com. There's about 24 of you who have given feedback so far. We'd love as many of you as you can. I'm just going to give a moment. Okay. Yeah, great. So far, agricultural groundwater user, there's lots of you here. That's great. Actually, in just a moment, some of the questions that we ask are going to be specific to agricultural users and landowners. So stay tuned for that. It's
Amy?
great to see. Yeah. For now, it's the main one that you would identify with. This is still really helpful to know. Okay, sorry about that, you guys. Okay, I'm gonna give it just a couple more seconds and then we're gonna close this one. Great. All right, so what are the top 3 groundwater management goals that are most important to you? And I'm hoping that this one is also actually set up to be able to select more than one. If not, maybe Lupe, you could go in and take this quiz, or Susanna, and find out. So what are the top 3 groundwater management goals that are most important to you? And of course, we're imagining that all of these are important to everybody, and it really does help us to know how to prioritize, both in terms of when we get to implementation and time and resources. There will be some choices that have to be made along the way. So it's really helpful to know. Might be availability of groundwater for agricultural use. That seems like a big one. Reliability of groundwater supply, increasing water available in wells because of wells drying up, increasing water availability, let's see, of groundwater for industrial use. Wow, it's a little hard to read them in line because they jump around. Okay, oops. Just I'll let you read through those for just a moment. Okay.
And it should be allowing you to select multiple responses now. Sorry about that, everyone.
Yeah, great, thanks. Okay. So there's about 31 respondents. This is great. So it looks like availability of groundwater use for residential use, groundwater supply, environmental use is getting up there, increasing groundwater recharge. Yeah, these are great information for us to know about. Again, if you haven't joined us on Slido, you can go to slido.com and enter 3GSP. And the reason I keep reiterating that is because there are 70 attendees and only 36 respondents. And so I know some of you are out there that haven't replied yet. We'd love for you to reply if you're able. Okay, I'm going to close this in the next few seconds. So again, you can just wrap up what your top 3 groundwater management goals are that are most important to you. Okay, 38, great. Okay, so this is not one of the polls yet. This is just a little precursor. So project and management actions, or PMAs, on farm fields could include different voluntary activities depending on the agricultural operations and where the field is located in the Solano subbasin. So keeping that in mind, that there are different voluntary activities that might support. This is just the Spanish version for our Spanish-speaking community members that are here. So are you interested in participating in either of these now or in the future? So that's in recharge with stormwater capture or irrigation efficiency practices that benefit groundwater. So again, this is really for our agricultural friends that are joining us this evening. If you are interested in, and you could select both of these, recharge with stormwater capture or irrigation efficiency practices that benefit groundwater. You might be doing those now, in which case we'd still love to know which ones you are, or in the future, if you're up for that, please select this information. And there'll be another question for us to potentially follow up with you if you're interested. Yeah, so there seems like there's lots of folks that are interested in recharge with stormwater capture. And just want to make sure that folks can select more than one here. Checking with my team that we know that a little mishap on the first one. Okay, perfect. 21, 23 folks. Looks like there was lots of agriculture folks here with us tonight, which we're really glad to have you here. Sometimes it's not always easy to get the kind of feedback we want from different communities. And so knowing that there's so many folks from the agricultural community here this evening is great, because we really, with many of the stakeholders within the Solano subbase, we really want to hear from you. So it's great to get this feedback. Okay, so I'm going to close this one. This is great for now. If you would like to be contacted to learn more about the PMAs, it's going to give you a chance to enter your name and email address. It won't show up on the screen, so it'll just come to the Ag Innovations team, and we'll follow up with you if you like, or someone from the project team will eventually. So just to know that it's not going to be flashed. If you would like to be contacted, if you would like to be contacted, you can go ahead and put that information in now. And I'll just wait a moment, getting your name and email address if you want to be contacted about either the stormwater recharge or the irrigation efficiencies. And another option is, of course, always to email us. Another plug for that is info@aginnovations.org. Okay. And I might cut you off. There's a couple folks. Oh, 5, that's great to know. Would love to be in touch with you. And if I move on to the next one before you're able to complete it, you can always just shoot us an email. Once I go to the next screen, it'll be cut off. Okay. All right. Thanks so much for the folks that did that. And if you didn't get your name and email in there, you can email us. All right. The last one, what questions, actually, I don't think it's the last question. We're close. What questions, if any, would you want to see answered before these management actions were implemented? So are there questions out there that before you felt comfortable having some of the management actions that Vicki spoke about, or that might get proposed later on in the process, what would you like to see answered before these were implemented? Are there any questions that come to mind or any concerns that you'd like reconciled before we were to take steps to implement? And again, these are anonymous, so if we won't know who said it, but we'd love to see if there are any questions. And we're nearing the end of our time, and I'm wanting to wrap up, make sure we get out of here right at 7:30. So yeah, by these management actions, it's a good question. What do you mean by these? These were the management actions, for example, potentially stormwater recharge, irrigation efficiency practices, or others that, I don't know, Vicki, if you want to speak to other management actions that.
Sure, conservation is one, trying to look at other sources of supply, the conjunctive use of surface water and groundwater, even more than what is already occurring to a large degree in this subbasin. In the section that we're developing and about to release to the Solano Collaborative for review, there will be a large table of all of the projects and management actions and ideas that we received input on from the collaborative and the GSAs. But there are some key projects and management actions that we've touched on tonight, particularly recharge opportunities.
Great. Thanks, Vicki. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next one. How would you like to be notified if management actions are being discussed for your area? And whether it's these management, I could see maybe the term these management actions or management actions in general, whether we've discussed them or not, that there will be likely management actions suggested or implemented in different parts of the subbasin. So if that were to happen, how would you like to be notified? Through public meeting, a focus group meeting with different sectors of the community, announcements on the Solano GSP website, postcard mailing to residents, or other. So it'd be great to know how you'd like to be notified. Yeah, great. Thanks, folks. And we're 2 minutes away, so tracking time, and we will be done soon. I just want to go over briefly next steps if possible. Okay, great. So it looks like public meetings is a great way. Announcements on the GSP through the GSP newsletter is another good one. So I'm going to wrap up this question. This is great information. If you have any final thoughts, click them now. All right. All right, and if you selected other, what kinds of additional outreach? Let's just see where was there? Yeah, there were a few others. Okay, so if there were others, what kind of outreach would you like to see? We really want to be in touch with you folks in ways that are effective for you all. So it would be great to, yep, through email. Great, and emails, the best way for you to get emails is through the Solano GSP newsletter. So if you haven't signed up for the Solano GSP newsletter, please make your way over to the solanogsp.com, which is our website, and you can sign up for the newsletter. That's a great way to get emails. Yeah, so a couple emails there. That's the best way, emails or calls. Okay, so unfortunately, I'm gonna have to stop this one. Lupe said she can keep the contact question open. So I'm going to do that. I'll leave this one open and I'm going to stop. Let's see. Oops, my apologies. Yeah, there we go. That's that one. So I'll keep that open. I'm going to stop my screen from sharing that. But if you do want to continue to give your contact information, let us know. And my team, someone from my team, I'd love for you to put the feedback form into the chat. So there's a way to give feedback on this meeting. And really briefly, I'm going to just flash a slide for next steps. I know it's 7:30, so as you sign off, you can see the next steps. Comment on the GSP sections, the September Community Advisory Committee meeting, September 23rd. You can register for that on the Solano GSP website. There will be a November virtual town hall. Join your GSA board meetings. And of course, you can email info@aginnovations.org with any questions. So thank you again for all of you for joining. And thank you to all the presenters for sharing such valuable information and the GSA members for all the work you're doing behind the scenes. Taking a full team, really grateful to have you all with us tonight. And that's a wrap.